Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 7 of my Witchwood card review. 4 new cards this time around, including 2 new class legendaries. So if you're short on time, you can use the link in the description to skip to the end of the video, just check out the cards and my quick ratings. Or if you have a little while to talk about these cards, let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. Up first here we have the new Hunter Legendary, Emeriss, and man, this card looks cool. I don't know why, but the green Hunter card back alongside the vibrant green of Emeriss and the crazy pose and that tiny little adventurer standing there looking like they're about to take on Emeriss. I just love the aesthetic of this card. And Emeriss is a pretty cool character in Warcraft. I have some fond memories of as well, so super excited about this one. Emeriss is a 10 mana 8/8 dragon for Hunter, of course, and the battle cry reads, double the attack and health of all minions in your hand. So this is basically like the hand buff dream. The card that Don Honcho and all the hand buff stuff from Mean Streets of Gadget Zan always wanted to be. It's finally here with Emeriss. Instead of just getting like a measly 5/5 or whatever extra stats, you get double your stats. So your Savannah Highmanes become 12 10s. Your Bittertide Hydras become 16 16s. And you can pretty quickly see just how much raw value that can add up to. You get some really giant, scary minions really quickly. Now, of course, because of the way doubling things scales, of course, the value of the buff for Emeriss here is much better on bigger things than on smaller things. A 1/1 merely turns into a 2/2. Whereas a 10/10 turns into a 20/20. So the buff becomes +10/+10 instead of +1/+1. So for a couple reasons, clearly Emeriss is the sort of card that would work much better in a slower deck with bigger minions. Of course, on top of that is the fact that he's a 10 mana card. And that is a incredibly slow style of play. 10 drops in Hearthstone to find success typically have to do something very, very quickly to the board, or add some sort of ridiculous long-term value. Think some of the Death Knights like Jaina. She's a 9-drop, but basically a super late-game drop. For them to work, they have to be defensive and add some sort of just inevitability to the game. Emeriss, unfortunately, I'm afraid, despite how much I want to love this card and how cool the effect is and how big and scary everything gets, I think he is just going to be too slow. You basically have to play a 10-mana 8/8. You don't get the value back from Emeriss until future turns, and frankly, to get all of the value back, if you buff 5, 6, 7 minions, of course, it might take 5 or 6 or 7 turns to get that much value out of it, and that's a really, really long time in Hearthstone. Another problem compounding on top of that is the fact that so far Hunter still isn't really a controlled deck. They keep getting more and more tools, but we've never seen a dominant late game Hunter really make sense. Even decks that run Rexxar and some of the slower spells and removal options end up looking a bit more like mid-range decks, or at the very least Rexxar empowers any sort of late game potential they have, but that's not really what they're designed to do. Now Rexxar is worth talking about with Emeriss because if you can build a deck that camps build a beast, Zombeast in your hand, like if you can create a Zombeast every turn and bank it in your hand and play some other stuff in the meantime, then you could get some ridiculous results off Emeriss. You can get, for instance, let's say combine a Bittertide Hydra and a Stone Tusk Boar, you got a 9/9 charging minion in your hand, you double it with Emeriss and suddenly you have an 18/18 charger in your hand. That is absolutely bonkers. But that style of play is really tough for Hunter because usually they don't have a lot of card draw, so they run out of cards in their hand. Another base problem for Emeriss really is that if you don't have cards in your hand, how does it work? Spell Hunter is also a really popular archetype for Hunter. But if you don't have minions in your deck because you're running out of spells, how does Emeriss work? Obviously, it wouldn't go into that sort of deck, but we haven't found a super successful Hunter deck right now. So something would have to change. We're going to have to see something new and different to empower a card like Emeriss. And then at the end of the day, I'm still worried that even if all that lined up, he still might be just a little bit too slow. I do think the one potential outlet for a card like Emeriss is as an enabler for some sort of OTK, or I guess really a TTK, a 2-turn kill, where he sets up some sort of just unavoidable burst damage combo. I haven't thought through all the possible options here. We already talked about like the Bittertide Hydra scenario, but a more predictable and reliable one might just be something like keeping a Leroy Jenkins in your hand alongside a Faceless Manipulator. If your Leroy gets buffed by Emeriss, he becomes a 12/4, which is 12 instant damage, and then your Faceless Manipulator, of course, can be played alongside it for 10 mana. We know you're at 10 mana because you played Emeriss. Then you have 24 charging damage, which is comparable to something like, I guess you'd call the Reno Lock of old. Often used to run Leroy, Power Overwhelming, plus Faceless Manipulator, sometimes with a Soulfire in there as well, for a 24 damage burst, and that was how it won games. But for that to work, it had to have things like Reno and other really super defensive cards that were available to Warlock. It also didn't necessarily need a big setup with something like Emeriss where you're kind of passing a 10 mana turn, which can be really difficult to achieve. So there is some combo potential stuff that this can set up. There is also just the raw stat value path, which seems much, much harder to work just because of the speed issues. So I want to love this card. It's so cool. The artwork is amazing. I'm going to try my hardest to make this thing work, of course. But I do think it's probably just going to fall short because it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing we've seen succeed in Hearthstone in the past. So now let's talk about another new legendary here. This is a warrior legendary, Darius Crowley, a new 5-mana 4/4 with Rush. And he also reads, after this attacks and kills a minion, gain +2/+2. Now we have seen that effect before in Hearthstone on the card Boogie Monster. You may have forgotten Boogie Monster was a card because you've probably never really seen it in a game. It was prominently featured in my very popular old video, the 10 worst legendaries in Hearthstone, and that still holds true to this day. Boogie Monster has never found success, and that might make you think right away, oh my god, Darius Crowley is just Boogie Monster 2.0. This is absolutely awful. But of course, there's a really big distinction here with Darius Crowley, or a couple distinctions in fact. First and foremost is that it has Rush. So you do get to attack with this immediately, which makes it much more likely that this effect is in fact going to go off. Whereas with Boogie Monster, it sits there passively and your opponent gets to remove it before you ever get any extra value out of its effect. So the Rush helps a lot, not to mention Darius Crowley is also cheaper at 5 mana, so you can play it earlier in the game and hope to get it to snowball sooner and snowball for longer, therefore making this effect have a larger impact over the course of the game. So clearly much better of a card than Boogie Monster, but that's not saying very much, is it? And I still think Darius Crowley has some challenges. The ideal scenario here is you play Darius Crowley and you trade into, like, I don't know, a 1/4. You trade into your opponent's Stonehill Defender. And suddenly you then get a 6/5 minion on your side of the board. You've cleared something, and you've got a 6/5. It is also notably damaged, which of course Warrior can sometimes synergize with damaged minions. So that's a slight upside. Things like Battle Rage, for instance, could draw you an extra card with something like Darius Crowley. And then theoretically, if your opponent can't handle the 6/5 minion, maybe you get to trade into a 2/5 next turn. And then suddenly you get to 8 attack. And you go to 5 health, I guess you'd be at that point. And maybe it just continues to snowball, right? And you get this giant threat that your opponent just can never resolve. But I think that's the dreaming big scenario. That's like the perfect world. What is much more likely in my mind is that you get to turn 5 and your opponent has a 5/5 out there. Or frankly, even a 4/5. Even if they just played a Chillwind Yeti, Darius Crowley is going to fall short. He can't do anything. He would just trade and die. He'd never get his buff. Even cards like Tar Creeper, Darius Crowley doesn't really do all that much. It doesn't kill the Tar Creeper, and then it goes down to 1 health, essentially. It wouldn't get buffed, so it would become a 4/1 on board. That's just not that good. It just doesn't do that much. If this was a 5-mana 5/5 with Rush, it would be so much better. It would take so many more favorable trades. It would have that little bit of extra health to help keep it alive in future turns. And frankly, it would be very powerful, of course, but legendaries need to be powerful, and Warrior's in a tough spot right now, so it probably needs a powerful legendary. At the very least, making this like a 3/6 would have been way better, because it could have traded into small stuff, and that higher health total could have kept it around long enough to really gain the value and the snowball of its effect. But at only 4 base health, and only 4 base attack, it can't really do either. It can't threaten the bigger stuff immediately. It doesn't trade that favorably into smaller things either. So it just lingers around with like 1 or 2 or 3 health after the trades, and then your opponent can easily dispose of it with another small minion. And like, yes, it maybe goes 2 for 1, but that's not a giant, awesome, legendary kind of thing. That feels just like a normal Hearthstone card that isn't nearly on the power level that we expect really good Hearthstone cards to be at today. So I just don't see this one working very well. Now, that said, if something like a rush buff card comes into play where, give your rush minions plus 3 health, or give your rush minions immune this turn, or some other sort of rush synergy thing, maybe Darius Crowley makes more sense. Maybe even just comboing it with other cards that, Rampage, for instance, could be cool. You cast, Cruel Taskmaster and Rampage on Darius Crowley to make him like your all-in minion and do something super awesome. But of course, that's like a 3-card combo, and that seems really shaky to me. But if some other additions to the set come out, maybe there's a small glimmer of hope for Darius Crowley. But of course, the more cards you require to make something successful, the less likely it is to be good. So it's possible. I'm not ruling out all hope for Darius Crowley. This is not a 1-star card, an absolute failure. But you know what? It's probably not a 3-star card either, and definitely not anything higher in my mind. There are some real fundamental issues with making this one work, so I think it's ultimately going to land just shy of the mark. So now let's talk about Coffin Crasher, and this is another card aesthetically that I just love. This artwork is hilarious. It's perfect. I can't wait to see it in golden. It's just amazing. And Coffin Crasher is a priest card here, a 6-mana, 6/5, Death Rattle. Summon a Death Rattle minion from your hand. So clearly here we have a Death Rattle synergy card for Priest, of which Priest has gotten a lot. Priest does still have the quest in standard format, so there's always the idea that this could be some sort of quest enabler. Summoning a minion from your hand would count to activate your quest as well. But of course, Quest Priest has never found a lot of success, and with N'Zoth rotating out of standard format, I think it's even less likely that Quest Priest finds success. So I'm not going to assess Coffin Crasher as some sort of quest enabler, even though it would, of course, if it goes off, give you 2 quest activations. That'd be pretty cool, although fairly late in the game, I must admit. But I will just assess it as sort of a generic value card, because it can be, right? It's almost a Cairn Bloodhoof in a way. Cairn, of course, has the body baked into it, but Coffin Crasher can pull something out of your hand and can pull something really big out of your hand. I think the most notable example that comes to mind is the card Obsidian Statue, the giant Death Rattle dude for Priest that is my absolute nightmare in Hearthstone most of the time. One of my least favorite cards to play against, especially in Big Priest when they cheat it out super early in the game. And of course, Coffin Crasher can cheat out Obsidian Statue fairly early in the game. But the distinction there between really early in the game and fairly early in the game is a huge margin. It is absolutely enormous. Because a Big Priest playing Obsidian Statue on turn 3 or 4 with Barnes or Eternal Servitude is really, really powerful at shutting down aggro and setting up future plays. Coffin Crasher summoning Obsidian Statue on like turn 6 or 7, because remember, you do have to kill your Coffin Crasher, so it might have to attack into something to actually kill itself, because Priest doesn't have that Dark Pact instant enabler that Warlock has, at least not yet. That's far later in the game. It's multiple turns later. So an Obsidian Statue on turn 6 or 7 isn't that big of a discount. It's only, 2 or 3 mana discount, essentially, as opposed to a 5 or 6 mana discount. And it's not as good at shutting down aggro, because by the time you get to turn 6 or 7 and you play something like Coffin Crasher, which is a non-taunt minion that your opponent can just ignore for a whole 6 mana, they're just going to kill you. It's just a really slow play in that regard. So this is not the Voidwalker / Big Priest sort of cheat out mechanic card. I don't think that's what this is, although a lot of people are identifying that as an opportunity. Warlock and Voidcaller is great because of Dark Pact, and Voidcaller's only 4 mana, so you get it out super soon. That's a much more consistent thing. This is also not a Possessed Lackey style card, because Possessed Lackey pulls the card from your deck, not from your hand, which is a huge distinction because it's drawing the card for you. Whereas with Coffin Crasher, you have to already have the card in your hand, and sometimes you just won't have that Obsidian Statue that you need in hand. So the reliability of something like Coffin Crasher and Obsidian Statue, to me, seems more like a dream than a reality. I think that's going to be really hard. So that's what a lot of people have been identifying as opportunities for this card. I don't want to look at it that way. I do want to look at it, though, as just a value card. It's the kind of thing that it's just another Cairn. Now, I don't think it's better than Cairn necessarily, but if you need a lot of Death Rattle minions, you need the sort of stuff that a control priest wants to do, and maybe you have some other Death Rattle synergies, Coffin Crasher could create some really interesting chains. Like, you could Coffin Crasher into Coffin Crasher into an Obsidian statue, and that's just a lot of stuff for your opponent to deal with. So I do think this card is still okay as a just mid-range minion, a fairly threatening guy, better than something like Bone Drake in some ways, and other ways worse, but similar, and Bone Drake's a card that's like almost playable. So this would be fantastic in Arena often, even if you don't have a super high Death Rattle deck, just as a 6/5, it's not that bad, and occasionally that high roll Death Rattle pulled from your hand could be huge. But in Constructed, I think it's got a little bit of a chance to succeed. I don't think there's some broken, busted combo with it. Maybe if we get some better Death Rattles that seem like they're going to do crazy things, perhaps Coffin Crasher makes a lot of sense. If you get another card that says, like, summon, if it's like a 2-mana minion that says summon a 1/1 copy of a Death Rattle from your hand, and you have some Coffin Crashers, then yes, it would absolutely be worth running. So because this effect is like unique enough and powerful enough on its own right, I do see some lines for this card to find success eventually. Maybe it's not even in this meta. Maybe it's in a future meta. So I don't see some absurd potential right now, today. I don't think this becomes meta-defining in any way, shape, or form. But down the road, Coffin Crasher is the sort of card that might just work somewhere. It's fundamentally okay. It does things that you like. And usually that's how I'm rating my cards. It's just, is it the kind of thing that in Hearthstone normally has attributes that we appreciate and attributes that could find some path to success. And Coffin Crasher, to me, is in that realm. It's that mid-range value sort of minion that could just work. And now finally here I have one last card, the Ravencaller, a new neutral minion at 3 mana. It's a 2/1 with a battle cry that reads, add 2 random 1-cost minions to your hand. And I think pretty quickly you could identify this card as a sort of aggro card. It's a cheaper minion that gives you more cheap minions, and hey, it seems like it might be okay in an aggro deck that's looking to flood the board. I don't think that's very true, or at least if it is true, this card is absolutely terrible, because aggro, the last thing they want to do is sacrifice tempo for value in hand, and that's exactly what this card does. You play a really bad minion on turn 3 to get some resources to use later, and that's the last thing you need in aggro. You want to play great stuff now as fast as possible to pressure your opponent and not worry so much about your hand. Yes, reload opportunities are good in aggro, but not when they come at the cost of on-board presence at the moment. So Ravencaller is really weird in that regard. Like, you don't want to play a 2/1 on turn 3 in an aggro deck. And of course, also random 1-cost minions aren't very good on average. There are some high roll opportunities there, of course, but the average 1-drop is just not going to be a great card. So you get a bundle of junk, basically, when you play Ravencaller. Nobody's going to be excited about that. And in a control deck, of course, also 1-drops just don't go far enough. This body's still garbage, so not something that would fit in a mid-range or control deck either. This card, at a surface level, is just fundamentally bad in my mind. Now, that said, there's one tiny little glimmer of hope for Ravencaller, and that is specifically in Quest Hunter. Quest Hunter looking to play 1-mana minions in order to activate its quest. Of course, Quest Hunter has been something people have tried to make work over and over again since Journey to Unguro. We cannot find success. Blizzard has printed a couple synergy cards for the deck. They just aren't enough to empower it. But frankly, Ravencaller would fit pretty darn well into that environment, because it's one card that turns into 2 quest activations while also committing at least a little bit to the board. So I think this is something you could run in Quest Hunter. Do I think it's good enough to make Quest Hunter an actually competitively viable deck? No, I still don't think it's there. Frankly, I think Quest Hunter's problem is really more with the reward than the activation. I don't think Queen Carnassa and Carnassa's Brood is that great of a reward. So that's the fundamental issue with Quest Hunter. Ravencaller could help you activate it more consistently, but it's still not going to be a strong enough deck. There's just not enough swing there in Quest Hunter to make it good once you even finish your quest. So, yes, some potential for Quest Hunter. If somehow in a miracle way Quest Hunter becomes amazing, who knows? Maybe Emeriss will empower Quest Hunter. It won't. Spoiler alert, it won't. But if that magical event happens, if that miracle occurs, then Ravencaller could become a playable card. Otherwise, I think just absolute garbage. I don't know who would want to run this or why. Maybe slightly okay in Arena, but in Constructed, just not nearly competitive enough. This feels very much like a pack filler sort of card, just to throw away. The artwork is frankly pretty awesome. I really like the artwork. It's good, but beyond that, just nothing here to marvel at all. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for part 7 of my Witchwood card review. Not the most exciting set of cards, admittedly. That's been a bit of a trend so far. I would say, though, don't fret. There's been some good cards. There's some exciting stuff. And I have to trust that Blizzard has something up their sleeves. On top of that, I have to say, I don't think too many random or crazy high roll style cards yet. A lot of stuff that's Rush in particular is about consistency and predictability as far as what you can do on the board is concerned. So maybe a little change in philosophy we're detecting here. That's possible, and I think maybe it could be good for Hearthstone, but we'll see. Who knows what is coming up next, because there's a lot of cards left. That said, let's go ahead and jump into my quick reviews where I rate each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Emeriss is a 2-star card. Darius Crowley is a 2-star card. Coffin Crasher is a 3-star card. Ravencaller is a 1-star card. And there you go, folks. That's it. That wraps it up completely for part 7. I'm curious what you guys have to say. What do you think about these cards? Did I underrate something? Did I miss some awesome potential synergy? Are they going to surprise me in a major way? I hope so. So share that in the comments below. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why I'm right. Tell me your thoughts. I love hearing what you guys have to say. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.